Hi, I'm Steve, and welcome to Sights Less Seen, where I visit those maybe not so well-known places you may not find in the normal tourist guide. Today, I'm at Henricus Historical Site in Chester, Virginia, about 20 miles south of Richmond. Established in 1611, it is the second successful British colony in the Americas, first, of course, being Jamestown. Let's go back in time about 400 years, and entering through these gates, you come to the town of Henricus, Virginia. But before we talk about the town itself, we need to talk a little bit about the history that predated the establishment of Henricus. It began in 1585 due to a variety of reasons, primarily religious differences, English support for the Dutch revolt against Spain, privateering against each other, and, most importantly, colonial rivalry in the New World. With the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1604, a peace treaty was signed, albeit an uneasy one. However, there was still a very intense rivalry in the New World. One particular incident illustrating this was the massacre of shipwrecked English civilian sailors by a Spanish garrison in Florida. England's answer to the Spanish was the establishment of Henricus in 1611, about 80 miles upriver of Jamestown, Virginia. This removed the colony's principal town further upriver, which made it more difficult for the Spanish forces to attack it, and it also got the settlers out of a swampy area around Jamestown. The name Henricus, or Henricus, primarily is of Latin origin, and it's a form of the name Henry, meaning ruler of the home, or home ruler. This settlement was named after Prince Henry, the eldest son of King James I of England. He was the heir apparent to the English throne at the time of the settlement's founding. In 1611, under orders from the Virginia Company of London, 300 musketeers, led by Sir Thomas Dale, who served as a deputy governor of Virginia from 1611 to 1616, arrived in the struggling Virginia colony of Jamestown to establish a new capital. Now, as I mentioned earlier, they traveled 80 miles west up the James River, where they found a thriving community of around 250 Virginia Indians who were part of a powerful Powhatan Confederacy. This strong and thriving native community had resided in the Tidewater area of Virginia prior to 1607. At the time of Thomas Dale's contact, there was a well-organized collective of tribes led by a man called Powhatan. Powhatan had organized a few dozen larger and several smaller tribes into a regional power of over 30,000 native people. The two westernmost communities under Powhatan's authority were the Arohatek and Appomattox people. Okay, let's go back to Thomas Dale now. By the autumn of 1611, he had scouted a property near the Arohatek community about 80 miles upriver from Jamestown, and quickly prepared logistics and materials at Jamestown to establish a new seat of government upriver. The force that marched westward from Jamestown was a mix of new colonists that had come with Dale to Virginia in 1611, trained as militia, as well as veteran fighters who had been in Virginia since before Dale, and were commanded by the elite governor's guard officer, Captain Brewster. Powhatan warriors, led by a great war leader, who the English called Jack of the Feathers, launched attacks at Dale's troops. However, these attacks failed, and by the winter of 1611-1612, a 7-acre fort was built, demonstrating the first permanent successful expansion of the Virginia colony. Now remember, the actual fort was about 7 acres, as I said. This park is smaller, but it recreates some of the more important buildings. By 1612, John Rolfe, an English explorer, farmer, and merchant who had also come to Jamestown, had planted an experimental growth of Spanish seeds of tobacco that proved successful in the soil of Tidewater, Virginia. Those trials of Spanish tobacco flourished, and thoughts of great profit grew with them. Now, I find this little piece of information rather interesting. A few years before Virginia was settled, King James I, who was no fan of tobacco, wrote a book against its use, but in the end, he would support the colony's efforts and would forbid its growth anywhere but Virginia. Now, let's talk a little bit about one of the most well-known people associated with the British settlements here, Pocahontas. Although everything you hear or read about her mentions Jamestown, and not Henricus, she spent a lot of time here. She was about 16 years old when she was captured in 1613 and brought by Sir Thomas Dale to Reverend Alexander Whitaker at Rock Hall, the parsonage in Henricus, for Christian instruction. Most likely she would have lived at Rock Hall during this time, and she eventually did convert to Christianity. She accompanied Thomas Dale's expedition to the Powhatan capital in March of 1614, and a month later, in April, she married John Rolfe, who was also on Dale's expedition, not John Smith like some people might think. They lived across the river from Henricus, and this is where their son was born. In 1616, she traveled to London with her husband, where she eventually died of an unknown cause just before they were to return to Virginia in 1617. Let's talk a little bit about the buildings that are here. By 1613, work had begun on the first Anglo hospital in the New World, called Mount Mulatto. It was built in Coxendale, the English community across the James River from Dale's fort. It was intended as a guest house, or most likely a receiving center, for a great influx of colonists Dale expected in the years to come. It had beds for 80 persons, many of whom probably after that long boat ride across the Atlantic Ocean were sick. And it had an adequate staff for their assistance in recovery. The ordinary, or the tavern, served as a gathering place for the settlers to relax. Now, I think it's rather interesting that it's next to a hospital, just in case someone relaxed a little too much and had to be carried over to the hospital to sleep it off. The officers' cabins were close to the front gate. This provided for their close control of the guards, the oversight of anyone entering the compound, and a quick response to any attacks. Each of these rooms are about 9 by 12, which definitely doesn't provide much space. Everything the officer owned was kept in here. Oh, a little bit of information that I think is rather interesting. If you look at drawings of uniforms of this time frame, you'll see cutout holes in the armpits. This was not necessarily for maneuverability, but for ventilation. The uniforms were very heavy and extremely hot. The cutouts helped to keep the soldier a little bit cooler. The church was the most significant building here and served as the main gathering place. It was the heart of a community, where the people came for religious services, which, by the way, were mandatory, meetings, and to receive important information about the town. Now, many investors of the settlement wanted to establish a college for native children, perhaps in response to the Pocahontas conversion. In 1618, they obtained a royal charter from King James I for a proposed university. In 1619, the historic First Virginia General Assembly met at Jamestown and passed their fifth petition, which said, "Send men to erect the college," referred to as a work of conversion, and set aside land for it adjacent to and above Henricus. The school was first designed to have carefully selected Powhatan boys attend and learn literacy, trade sciences, agriculture, and Christianity. However, it was destroyed in the March 1622 attacks by the local tribes. After 8 years of continued peace between the English and Powhatan people, the new leader of the Powhatans, Pocahontas, decided to go to war to drive the British away. His attacks stretched over 70 miles of the Virginia countryside and killed over 300 colonists. The fort was abandoned in 1622 and largely destroyed by the Powhatans afterwards. However, interestingly, by 1623, more settlers occupied this area than before the war. The next year, James I dissolved the Virginia Company, seizing its assets and transforming the private company colony into a royal one. The crown controlled it from then on. As you can see, life was very difficult here. But even with all the troubles and trials and tribulations that they had, people stayed. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have, leave me a comment. And go back and see my other videos too. I'm Steve. I'll see you next time on sights less seen.